Okay, Andrea, I am going to attempt to show you how to do your pattern. So what I did was I cast on 21 stitches like you are working with at the moment onto a circular needle. I am holding my 21 stitches on the needle in my left hand, the unworked stitches, and I also marked the front of I just want you to know that I know that I'm on row 1 because I marked it with a pin. I also put the stitch markers in so that I know when I need to move my yarn. I just wanted to let you know why you see all these stitch markers and what that is. I know you're going to start from scratch, but I was working on the pattern, so here we go. All right, row 1 says knit 4, okay? So 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to take my right hand with the empty needle in my right hand. I'm going to stick it in as if to knit with the yarn behind, and I'm going to knit 4 stitches. 1, oops, hope you can see that. 2, 3, 4. All right, and I come up to a stitch marker. So the stitch marker tells me I have to do something. I'm going to move that stitch marker and I'm going to slip it from my left needle onto my right. It tells me that I have to take the yarn that is in the back and I have to move it in the front because now I'm going to purl. I need to purl this next stitch. The way we purl is the yarn is in front. We put the needle in the front of the stitch and point it over the back of our shoulder, wrap the yarn around, pull down, pull through, and off the needle. We come to another stitch marker. It tells me that I have to do something. I'm going to move that stitch marker onto my right hand needle. I'm going to take the yarn that's in the front and move it to the back. That means I'm now going to be knitting. My pattern says knit the next 3. So I'm going to knit 1, knit 2, knit 3. Okay. I've got a stitch marker. It tells me I have to do something. I'm going to slip the stitch marker to my right hand needle. My pattern says I have to purl, so I'm going to bring the yarn from the back to the front. Pattern says purl this stitch. Yarn is in front. I'm going to stick the needle in the front of the stitch, push it back over the back of my shoulder, wrap the yarn around, pull down, push the stitch off the needle. Okay, I've got another stitch marker. I'm going to move that stitch marker to my right hand needle. It tells me I have to do something. I'm going to take the yarn that's in the front, I'm going to move it to the back, and my pattern says that I have to purl. Is that right? No, I'm sorry. I have to knit. My yarn's in the back. My pattern says I have to knit the next 3. Knit 1, knit 2, knit 3. Okay, I've got another stitch marker. I'm moving it to my right hand needle. I'm moving my yarn from the back to the front, which means I have to purl this stitch. And yes, that's what my pattern says. Purl 1, purl this 1 stitch. I come up to another stitch marker. I'm going to move it over to my right needle. It says I have to take my yarn from the front, move it to the back. There's 3 stitches. My pattern says knit the next 3. Knit 1, knit 2, knit 3. I come up to a stitch marker. I move it to my right hand needle. It says that I have to move my yarn to the front, and my pattern says I have to purl this stitch. I put the needle in the front, point it back over my shoulder, wrap the stitch, pull it down and off. I come to another stitch marker. I'm going to move the stitch marker to the right hand needle, and it says I have to move my yarn from the front to the back and that I have to knit that last stitch. And whoops, the last 4 stitches. Sorry, here we go. There's 4. Knit 1, knit 2, knit 3, knit 4. All right, and now we finished the row. So I take the yarn that's now, the needle that's now in my right hand, and I move it over to my left hand, because now these are the unworked stitches. And I need to make sure that the stitch marker is not facing me, because I need to do row 2 here. So I want to make sure that I have the stitch marker, that I see basically the purl side, not the knit side, because I want to now do row 2. All right, row 2 says I have to purl the first 4 stitches. So one of the first things you need to do, this is a little confusing, your yarn is hanging down in the front. I kind of put my hand underneath so that I can come up behind the yarn that's hanging in the front. So I can stick my needle in the purl way, in the front, going back. So my yarn is now in the front, and I need to purl 1. Okay, yarn is still in front, purl 2. Yarn is still in front, purl 3. Yarn is still in front, purl 4. I come up to a stitch marker. I move the stitch marker from my left needle to my right. It tells me that I have to take the yarn that's in the front, I have to move it to the back, and I have to, my pattern says I need to knit this next stitch. Yarn's in the back, I put the needle in as if to knit, and I knit that stitch. Come up to a stitch marker. I slip the stitch marker to the right hand needle. It tells me I need to take my yarn from the back, move it to the front, and get ready to purl these next 3 stitches. Purling, I put my needle in the front of the stitch and point it back over the back of my shoulder, wrap the yarn around, pull down, pull the stitch off. Yarn still in front, put the needle in the front of the stitch, point it over the shoulder, wrap around, down, and off. Yarn is still in the front of the work, put my needle in the front of the stitch, point it over my shoulder, around, down, and off. I come to a stitch marker. I'm going to move the stitch marker from the left to the right. It tells me I need to take the yarn that's in the front, and I need to move it to the back. It tells me I need to knit this next stitch. I'm going to put the needle in as if to knit, wrap it around, take it off. Stitch marker, move it from the left to the right. Says that I have to take the yarn that's in the back and move it to the front. Again, my pattern is telling me I have to purl these next stitches. Yarn is in the front. I put my needle in the front, point it over my shoulder, wrap around, down, and off. Second purl, put the needle in the front, down, off. Third purl stitch, yarn still in front, needle in the front of the stitch, point it over my shoulder, down, and off. Come to another stitch marker. Tells me I have to do something. I move the stitch marker to my right needle. It tells me that I have to take the yarn that's in the front and move it to the back, and my pattern says I have to knit this stitch. Don't forget to put your needle in the right way when you're knitting. Knit 1 stitch. Stitch marker, move it from the left to the right. Says I have to take the yarn that's in the back, move it to the front, and do 3 purls according to the pattern. Stick your needle in the front, point it over your shoulder, around, down, and off. Needle in the front of the stitch, point it over your shoulder, around, down, and off. Third purl, yarn is still in front, needle in the front of the stitch, around, down, and off. Stitch marker, move the stitch marker from the left to the right. It tells me I have to take the yarn that's in the front and move it to the back, and I need to knit this next stitch. Knit, don't forget, you put you're making the X with your needle, okay? And you knit that stitch. Stitch marker, move it from the left to the right, says move your yarn to the front, and basically you have the next 4 stitches to purl. Put your needle in the front, pointing over your shoulder, around, down, and off, over, around, down, and off. in the front, over your shoulder, around, down, and off. Last one, purl, around, down, and off. And then you've got that all finished. So you take the unknitted stitches, you put them in your left hand, and now you know, since this stitch marker or your safety pin is on the front, you now know you need to be doing row 1. So in your left hand are the unworked stitches, your right hand is your empty needle, and you would start by knitting these 4 stitches, then move your stitch marker, move your yarn to the front, and then you would purl this stitch, move your stitch marker, move your yarn to the back, and you would knit these next 3 stitches, and then you would move your stitch marker and your yarn to the front, and you would purl this, and then you would move your stitch marker and move your yarn to the back, and you would knit these next 3, and then you would move your stitch marker, yarn to the front, purl this next one, move the stitch marker, yarn to the back, knit the next 3, move the stitch marker, yarn to the front, purl this one, move the stitch marker, yarn to the back, and knit the next 4. And that would be row 1 again. Then you would turn it around and do row 2. Okay, hope that worked.